wrote a letter that was published in the Independent newspaper, addressed primarily for the attention of John Whittingdale, which was objecting to the terms of reference of the white paper, largely along the lines of that this is too economistic, it's driven purely by the value of the BBC being measured through its kind of economic, from an economic perspective, rather than social and political value that the BBC in all of its many different forms brings to bear on the UK. And that was signed by 398 people on that list, which was actually one of the largest kind of responses we've ever had to anything. So it was very indicative of a feeling, a mood within our sector, that this was something we were very, very concerned about. So it was crucial for the conference to have a panel addressing those gaps. So the idea is not just to repeat some of the discussions that have been ongoing. There's lots and lots of debates and forums talking now about the future of the BBC, but many of those have been constrained within certain terms that have already been set for us by the white paper. The view of this panel was to try and go beyond that and to talk in a much broader state about the important issues that are crucial for the future development of the BBC in the broadest way possible. So we have a very esteemed panel. They have been invited to talk for between 5 and 7 minutes each. Yes. I extended it by 2. I was very generous. An extra 2 minutes, which may prove to be my mistake. But they have 7 minutes, and I will briefly introduce who they are so you know who's talking. And then the idea is we go then again into a more roundtable discussion. And as much, we want it to be as lively and as interactive as possible, because we are at the end of a long day and we want to make sure we keep the energy up. So we have the first speaker, who will be Paddy Barwise, who will be known to you as Emeritus Professor of Management and Marketing at the London Business School and Visiting Fellow at the LSE. He has recently, this is just to prove his long credentials, has written on the economics of TV in a digital world, and very recently, 2015, What If There Were No BBC TV? So imagine that. Then we will be followed by Sophie Chalk. And Sophie has worked as a producer-director in television and radio since 1989. She's worked on TVAM, GMTV, Sky News, Yorkshire TV, Jazz FM, BBC World Service and Radio 4. She set up Rooftop Productions in 1998 to specialise in programmes for the developing world, and has worked for the IBT, the International Broadcasting Trust, as Director of Advocacy since 2011, so coming there with a kind of industry advocacy perspective. Then we will move to Des Freedman, Professor at Goldsmiths in my department, who has written widely on politics and media policy, and most recent book being The Contradictions of Media Power. He is also a founding member of the Media Reform Coalition and is the lead on a project that is running out of Goldsmiths into as an inquiry into the future of public service television, chaired by Lord Putnam. And he will be able to tell us more about that, but also, this is what we're not doing here, she says interjecting already, is a kind of defence of the BBC. This is trying to be also, we recognise there are problems, and what we want to see is a review that actually is open to addressing those properly. The next speaker then, our final esteemed speaker, is Bill Thompson, and Bill is well-known technology journalist and visiting professor at the Royal College of Arts. He appears weekly on Click on BBC World Service Radio, writes monthly columns for the Focus magazine, and is head of partnership development for the BBC Archive. Is very heavily involved in all the new processes of what the new charter will look like. So, Paddy, the floor is yours.
The first point I want to make is about this objecting to the way that so much of the debate is framed in economistic terms. And there are two reasons for challenging this. One is obvious and one is not obvious. The obvious reason is that television is obviously, broadcasting is obviously enormously important in ways other than in economic terms. Just to put that in perspective, people consume radio and TV for an average of about 6 hours a day. That's about almost 40% of waking hours. If you say, how important is this industry in economic, financial terms, it's maybe a bit less than 2% of consumer expenditure. So a situation in which something which is nearly 40% of people's waking hours, and of course it has important effects, social, psychological, political, you name it, cultural, okay, that is almost 40% of waking hours, and yet less than 2% of consumer expenditure, and yet the debate is sort of whatever, 75% dominated by financial numbers. That is, in a sense, the obvious argument. The non-obvious argument is that even within the narrow terms of an economic debate, this sort of squeezing of the BBC and public service broadcasting is wrong and is demonstrably wrong. And I'm speaking as a marketing person and a consumerist. I'm a former chairman of Which, so I'm very much concentrating on consumer issues as well as citizenship issues. As Natalie said, one of the things I did at the Reuters Institute in Oxford was looking in great detail of what would happen if there were no BBC television, and that is allowing for the assumption, which Whittingdale and others make, that the BBC has some crowding out effect on the commercial broadcasters. And even if you make optimistic assumptions about the increase in revenue that commercial broadcasters would get if there were no BBC television at all, and then how much of that would flow into original content for UK viewers, in pure, narrow economic consumer terms, range, quality, value for money, as if we were talking about baked beans, not broadcasting, most households would be demonstrably worse off. So that to me is the non-obvious reason for us challenging this, is even in their own terms, they've got it wrong. Second point is, I've been asked, what's missing from the debate? And I think for the last 25 years or so, we've, in a rather arm-waving sense, talked about the UK broadcasting ecology, but we haven't actually pinned down what exactly do we mean and why does it work, and its role within the wider creative industry. So I think one of the things we need to do is to frame this debate in more detail and much more explicitly in saying, well, what are the components of this broadcasting ecology? Why is ecology in fact rather a good metaphor for what we're talking about? And what evidence do we have about this? Some of you may have seen a book and TV programme by Dominic Sandbrook called The Great British Dream Factory, which does document this astonishing thing that the Brits of all people lost an empire, lost a manufacturing industry, and suddenly became the second superpower in popular culture, global popular culture, from Manchester United to Adele to, you name it, James Bond and Harry Potter and so on. What he doesn't talk about is, okay, how does that work in internal terms? And the reason I'm recommending that as an issue in the context of MeCCSA is that that's about a whole lot of soft issues. There is a growing literature on innovation clusters. That there was a book by a well-known journalist at The Economist in 1998 called The Death of Distance, and the Digerati were sort of predicting that geography would kind of go away because of the internet, and that is not what's happened. Okay, so Silicon Valley is still in Silicon Valley, the City of London is still the City of London, the best ceramic tiles are still made in a small area in North Italy, and so on. And so why is it that creativity and innovation is still geographically highly clustered, and the UK is a successful cluster in broadcasting, and of course within the UK we have smaller clusters, which is London and some others. Okay. Why does that happen in this industry? And clearly it's about some combination of human capital and social capital, informal networks and all that. And the reason I'm saying that is partly because I think it's been missing from the debate, but partly because I think it's an area which MeCCSA members are very well qualified to research, because it's about looking very closely at how do the creators of great content actually spend their time, who do they talk to, why do they congregate, and so on. So, let me suggest that is something to think about. And finally, a more speculative point, which you're better able to judge than me, but my impression is that media studies students are not that engaged in this debate, and I hope I'm wrong. You may tell me I am wrong, but it would be terrific if they could be more engaged. Now, the economic issues that I tend to get involved with, people tend to assume you have to be highly numerate and to have, formal training in economics. You really don't. You have to be sufficiently numerate not to be frightened by numbers, but it's not about Greek letters of the alphabet and that kind of maths. It's about, numbers and things like my 40% of time versus 2% of money kind of statistics. They are the generation, the British students among your students, they are the ones who are going to grow up in a world and have their own kids in a world in which is less good than it would be if we had more intelligent policies. So they should be engaged. It's quite possible that in 10 years' time only, we will have virtually no British broadcasting. Okay? I mean, were ITV to be bought by one of the American multinationals, and Channel 4 privatised, and the BBC slimmed down, and BBC Production and Radio 2 and Radio 1 sold off, what you're left with is the rest of the BBC, BT, Talk, and a minority of the major indies, and that's it. Thanks very much.
I think it's wise to strike a note of caution in terms of the future of our broadcasting, and that's where VLV, Voice of the Listener and Viewers, is really concerned. We don't want to lose something very precious that we have, which actually, what concerns us is not just the BBC, but the whole ecology, as Paddy was saying, and that's kind of what I'd like to talk about today. But the BBC is obviously a focus because we're looking at the white paper and the context of the white paper. The whole ecology of broadcasting in the UK is based on this mixed ecology of commercial and publicly owned, and that is working really well. And it may be unfashionable to say so, but maybe we shouldn't question the status quo too hard in that regard, because if Channel 4 is privatised and its remit will be reduced, I think if it's privatised or sold off, or even if it goes down a mutualisation model, which is possible, there'll be more pressure on it to invest its profits, not into programming but into the pockets of shareholders or those who have an interest in keeping that money to themselves. So Channel 4 privatisation concerns us, as do other gaps in the provision of public service broadcasting around UK children's production, or current affairs, or regional content. A lot of these have been highlighted by the Ofcom PSB review last year. There are problems. I'm not saying there aren't problems, but actually we're doing pretty well. So the BBC, what can we expect from the white paper? What's missing? Well, the first thing that strikes me about the white paper is that it will not discuss how to ensure that the BBC remains independent. This isn't really in the government's interest. The government probably quite likes to have the ability to control the BBC. The BBC needs to be independent from government. That's what VLV thinks anyway, and many others agree with us, I know. It's essential if it's to remain credible and survive in the long term. So regardless of what was said in the 192,000 responses to the BBC Green Paper, we must be aware the government actually has the right to do whatever it wants to the BBC. I'd always believed naively that having a royal charter was superior to statutory legislation, but somehow that conveys some sort of protection, sense that the Queen might step in if the government goes too far. I always thought that anyway, and this is my first charter, so I'm completely a newbie to this, and I was really, really dismayed to realise that in fact pretty much the government can do what it wants, unless there's huge public outcry. So the agreement which accompanies the charter can be revised any number of times during a charter period with no public consultation. This has happened twice in the previous charter with 2 big raids on BBC coffers, and independence is largely a matter of finance. If you haven't got the money, you can't really do very much, so it's one way the government can hit the BBC. So these raids on the BBC's coffers effectively undermine its independence. VLV has proposed in its submission to the Green Paper to set up a licence fee body independent of government to set the level of the licence fee and to assess any mid-term renegotiations of it. We got a QC to draft a bill which we included in our submission. It's very straightforward. We hope the DCMS will consider it seriously. I don't know whether we have any hope that will happen, but we'd like to propose that because it would provide greater independence to the BBC if it were financially more secure. An issue which is unlikely to be highlighted, I think, in the white paper is this great success of our ecology, our broadcasting ecology, and it doesn't really fit with the narrative that the Green Paper suggests, which is that the BBC should be minimised in order to sort of prevent it from impacting on the commercial competition. Commercial broadcasters are really doing very well. I'm just in the Evening Standard on the way down here on the train. There's a great article outlining how successful our broadcasting ecology is and what the year ahead holds. So there was a growth of 8%, according to the Evening Standard, in TV ad revenue in 2015, and that'll be a further 10% rise in 2016. So, the commercial broadcasters are doing well, Sky's doing well. What's the problem? Why does the BBC have to be cut back? We have to ask that question. It may sound old-fashioned, but I think we quite like what we've got. So let's fight to preserve that. Another issue which isn't featuring very much in the debate, and again I sound really old-fashioned, and I don't want to be old-fashioned. I think BLB gets accused of being old-fashioned quite a lot, but we're rather attached to this 6 hours of viewing a day, which according to Ofcom, and I can see people from Ofcom in the room, so I hope I'm not speaking out of turn, but according to Ofcom, about 95% of that is live or recorded on a TV set. So everybody's moving online, not quite yet. We need to slow down. We must remember that it costs money to be online. Free-to-air television is free. Once you've paid your licence fee and you've got your hardware, it's free. If you watch online, it costs you to have a super fast unlimited broadband connection. So it's not universal and it's not free. This worries us. We want TV that's affordable and is universal. That's one of the fundamentals of our public service broadcasting system. We want that to be maintained. It's the only way to ensure that quality is provided for all citizens, regardless of where they live, how much they earn or don't earn, and what their taste in programming are. I mean, it's the only way to guarantee a level playing field. So we're worried about the move to digital. Even if we all wanted to go digital and pay extra to do so, our infrastructure isn't ready for this yet. Nobody can quite tell us whether our infrastructure is going to be able to deal with the 13 million viewers who watched the final of Bake Off live, or when that's going to happen. BT can't. I mean, they say, well, yeah. They can't quite pin down when that's going to happen. So we mustn't rush into this. Our infrastructure isn't there yet. The BBC Digital, as I understand it, Bill, went black over Christmas. I was away, but I saw all the news about it. So what happens to all those BBC Three viewers who now have to watch online?
BBC One goes offline all the time. Nobody complains about that anymore.
We can ask you about that afterwards. Anyway, so
I'm happy to answer questions on that.
Anyway, but there is a question about if the system gets overloaded, what happens? So we shouldn't rush into digital. And finally, we think that digitalisation, or going online, watching everything online, is a slippery slope towards subscription. We're not technical experts, but it seems it's much easier to control access via online platforms than through the existing set-top boxes we have. And if you speak to Freeview, they tend to agree with that. So, we sort of think that we should all stop rushing towards the digital sphere and think a bit about actually 6 hours a day through TV sets. I don't know if the 6 hours is through TV sets or whether some of it's online, but the majority is.
It's the 6 hours a day is TV and radio.
Okay.
The great majority of that is through TV sets.
Yeah. So Finally, and probably the most important issue of all, is that the Green Paper repeatedly implies the BBC should be scaled down, as I've said, instead of talking about how it could provide better content and services for citizens. Now, it seems to me this is a real opportunity for us to say, what do we want from the BBC? What does it do well? What could it do better? And we need to shift this debate dramatically if we're going to take the opportunity to improve the BBC, which is what it should be. In an ideal world, Charter Review should be about how to make the BBC better, not necessarily to try to minimise its impact in a market that's already doing quite well. So I've suggested to VLB that if the white paper does go too far in reducing the BBC scale and scope, that we should mobilise our members and chain themselves to the railings with DCMS until the government listens. So I'm delighted in some ways that the white paper has been delayed. It was meant to come out midwinter, and now it's going to come out in May or June, so at least if it well improves a bit, it might be there. So that's what I'm hoping from VLB members. And actually many of them have said they will take a placard. No, they will. They'll take a placard and stand outside DCMS. So if it all goes wrong, VLB will beat that.
So 7 minutes on the gaps in the Green Paper is not easy, but one way of starting, I guess, is to read it. And if you read it, you will find some headlines about absences, which is that in the Green Paper there are 2 mentions of citizen and citizenship, in contrast to 59 mentions of markets. There is not a single reference to democracy, but there are 20 references to efficiency. There's one sad, lonely reference to something I've never heard of called knowledge, but there are 55 references to the much more everyday business of commercial activity. That's the headlines. I probably should sit down. That's the most empirical piece of evidence I've ever done in my life. I think there's so much to say, but the main way of putting this, under one umbrella, the main gap, the main issue that is not addressed is the very idea that public service broadcasting is a productive and necessary objective in its own right. In other words, the Green Paper assumes that public spaces are needed only when they won't damage commercial enterprises or when there is no appetite on the part of commercial businesses to occupy land that is either too expensive to build on because the investment will not be justified by an easy return. This totally misses out on the whole history and culture of public service broadcasting and the BBC, that in terms of the BBC, it was, and it remains, though we don't know for how long, a purposeful intervention into our media environment. In other words, it's not an accident, but it is a set of values inscribed into a specific institution that doesn't simply play by the rules of a market economy. The repeated assertion that we need to evaluate the BBC mainly in relation to its impact on the wider media market, that great phrase, raises for me, and I've said this before, but it raises one question which baffles me and I still haven't heard the answer to it. Why do they do this? Do we make this argument in relation to other areas of our lives? Do we judge public health provision on the basis of whether it makes life difficult for Bupa and private health providers, or do we welcome the fact that public institutions are designed to treat everyone irrespective of background or income? Do we want to curb public investment in our schools in case it hits the pockets of independent education and crowds out commercial competition? So this determination, which is so inscribed into the Green Paper, to assess value and performance in relation to commercial activity, as I said, is no accident. The lack of a talk about the value of public service in its own right is not, as my kids' school always like to remind me, an unplanned absence. It is an entirely deliberate part of government policy, which is to shrink public assets and to undermine the ethos of the public sector. Which means, and this is a weird argument you get, I've heard this question being put, is it ideological, the attacks by the government, or is it pragmatic? I think it's both, to be honest. It's both a vision statement of neoliberalism, but it's also a gesture, not just of backbenchers, but a gesture of what we need to do in times of austerity. Why should we be, the BBC should behave just like everyone else. Everyone should suffer the same, apart from the bankers who will not be reviewed anymore, according to George Osborne. Anyway, but talking of that, we shouldn't lose, and I can't remember who mentioned it, Paddy, you mentioned about BBC 4, Sophie, you mentioned Channel 4. We shouldn't lose focus on the fate of Channel 4 and the fact that should the government decide in the end not to privatise it, it's most likely going to be for quite, possibly ideological reasons, but more likely quite pragmatic ones as well, which is that is it worth antagonising Jon Snow and the guys from Peep Show and everyone else for the sake of a mere £1 billion and just alienate whole sectors of the creative economy? Probably not. So in a way, that's that the first set of gaps are all about the vision, or the very narrow vision that people have already made reference to. But slightly more controversially, I think there is a gap in the wider debates that I'd like to raise, which is about the reaction of the BBC itself. As an institution which will stand up for itself and the public that it's supposed to serve. I mean, I don't really get, who was it who said, do media students have a role to play? I don't really get the impression that the public have been that mobilised. It's great to hear what Sophie's saying about chaining ourselves, but actually the public hasn't been that engaged. The one argument that I've heard in several of the meetings, which I think is quite interesting, is the reaction that people have about the very shoddy deal forcing the BBC to pay for the licence fees for over 75s. And the person who takes the rap there, I mean, in a way, people don't even talk about the government in this. They talk about the chair of the BBC Trust. And I've heard at several meetings, how is this person still in post? It was when we had our launch of the inquiry that Natalie was talking about, Melvin Bragg, which he doesn't do that often, went like this, saying, how is she still in post? There's a lot of anger about that. When it comes to the behaviour of the executive itself, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong and Bill will correct me. It seems quite acquiescent in the debate because it is nervous, pretty understandably. It's been so eager to adopt the language of efficiency, in order it hopes to neutralise the debate. But I think that's quite a risky strategy because it just encourages its commercial competitors and its foes in government to keep coming back for more. So I think it needs to have a much more robust defence of its licence fee of the viewing public. Let me give one example in 1 minute of where it could really raise its game. And weirdly enough, and I probably shouldn't say it, this isn't a gap in the Green Paper, because the Green Paper does talk about this, and it's the question of whether the BBC is adequately representing different communities and pursuing diversity with sufficient energy. So I look back at the BBC Trust's Purpose Remit Survey reports, which are basically annual surveys of the viewing public about what they think of the BBC and the job that it's doing. And it produces something called performance gaps, which is a measure of the difference between how the audience thinks, how important the audience thinks something is, and whether that objective has been met. Where do you find, there aren't gaps all over. Some things the BBC does very well. It is in surplus in terms of, for example, introducing people to new talent. Radio 1 does this the whole time. Where do you think the biggest performance gaps are? 19% when it comes to the BBC, quote, representing my ethnic group. 18% gap in terms of supporting minority languages. The single lowest score in the whole of the survey was the 39% of the British non-white population who thought the BBC was, quote, good at representing their ethnicity. A figure that I think scandalously drops to less than 1/3 of the British black population who think that they're being adequately represented. If the BBC wants to build a robust defence of itself, it needs to do much more to listen to that, to start to address that, because then it will build up a much more actively loyal, not passively loyal. Most people are instinctively and passively loyal to the BBC, but those aren't the people who will be joining Sophie at the barricades when they are built. There are other issues, but I think that's the way we hear this phrase being the critical friend. That's, one level, it's a very pragmatic question. Critical friendship means we will support the BBC, but they have to address these flaws if they are to command the loyalty and energy to defend an institution which absolutely needs defending. People may lack the necessary motivation, if that isn't done, to vigorously defend what remains, above all, a very precious public resource. Thank you very much.
You're absolutely right. Ben's absolutely right about the need to build active support rather than just passive acceptance, because that's the only way that it will be a real debate. And that active support has to come from acknowledging the things that don't work as well as the things that do. And I think that Paddy made very important points about it not being about the economic impact of what the BBC does. I think Sophie makes some good points about the importance of viewing and some very bad points about the importance of television, which we'll come on to address later in the conversation. I speak from an interesting place Des didn't realise I worked for the BBC now. I actually have a staff job and everything. Look, well, I haven't got it with me. I have a staff pass. I've actually been there for 5 years, and very few of my friends realise this. Not because I'm ashamed of it, but because I sort of fitted the full-time job into the rest of my life, which involves being a technology journalist and a wit and raconteur, and a member of the boards of various charities and stuff like that, and running various websites. So as a consequence of that, I am both inside and outside the BBC. And sometimes I find myself saying we when I refer to the BBC, and I have to check myself. And sometimes I find myself doing it and think, actually, that's entirely appropriate. So it does mean I have to be quite careful about what I'm going to say today, only because I have these two roles. I don't care what happens as a result to me, but it means I'm trying to be quite precise in my language about the issues that I think are missing from the white paper and from the current discussion, so we can have a discussion about it, not answer everybody's questions in 5 minutes, because that wouldn't work. So, I'm both inside and outside the BBC. In my day job, I'm head of partnership development for the BBC Archive, and the role there is to put the BBC's archive at the service of audiences, and audiences include researchers, media academics, school children, anybody who might want it, and that's fine. So the easy thing for me to say now would be that the archive isn't receiving the attention it deserves in the debate about the BBC's future. And so I thought I'd go for the cheap laugh and just say the archive isn't receiving the attention it deserves in the debate about the BBC's future. Good. But the failure is, as with many other things we've heard about, a symptom. It's a symptom of the much broader issue. And that's about what the BBC is there for, why we invented it in the first place, what it was summoned from the vasty deeps to deliver to the UK and to the world, and what it can do these days when the technological infrastructure, the environment within which it operates, is so radically different from the world of 1922 or 1926. So most people, when they think about this debate, and the government is happy to frame the debate in this language, and Melvin Bloody Bragg goes on about it all the time, think it's all about the programmes. Our esteemed Director General will talk about the programmes until I pointed it out to him, and he now talks about programmes and services, which is some small improvement. Not everyone in the BBC is there to make programmes. At the recent debate on the BBC Charters, which the Mile End Institute hosted at the House of Lords, the discussion went round and round and was really quite fascinating, but it kept coming back to the BBC is there to make programmes, and of course it isn't. Read the Charter, it doesn't say programmes once. It says using television, radio and online to deliver the public purposes. The agreement says programmes because that's the way in which the BBC and DCMS have chosen to use access to the electromagnetic spectrum to do the things the BBC is asked to do. But the things the BBC is asked to do are not about making television programmes. It just chooses to do that as the best way to deliver. And maybe it's no longer the best way to deliver, or maybe certainly we need to have the conversation about whether that is the best way to deliver. Because the BBC is an engine for social change. It's an engineering organisation that develops new media and new technologies like radio and television and micro stereo and colour and DAB, things you may have heard of or haven't heard of, but that are deeply, deeply important. And it's a core cultural body that is and remains a custodian for a collection of world importance, that would be the archive, and that doesn't appear in the broader discourse. We don't talk about the BBC as a cultural institution on the same lines as the British Museum or the National Library of Scotland or something like that hosts and holds this stuff. Now the BBC stuff is different because it is commissioned. The British Museum didn't go out and actually carve the Rosetta Stone, it just acquired it in some way. I'm sure it was legal. But the BBC does commission the things it then curates on our interest. And so what's missing is that sort of conversation. What's also missing, and fundamentally for me, is a serious engagement with the implications of the move to the internet as the primary communications infrastructure. The people who are watching television, some of them are watching programmes on their big screens on the wall that are not television broadcasts, because they are being streamed. If you have a smart TV, you may not be aware of whether that data is coming to you via Freeview or FreeSat or your Skybox or IP from somewhere. And increasingly it's going to become less and less interesting. There are technical solutions to the challenge of how to do universal access over IP, and those conversations are happening inside the BBC and also in the Internet Society and elsewhere, because it's a problem that has to be solved. It's not yet solved, I'm not claiming it's sorted. And there's a lot of conversation internally about these sorts of things, some of which I kick off. But it isn't reflected in the public debate in the way I think it ought to be. So what I'd like to see is that wider perspective on the BBC's role in the modern world, a world where there are more mobile phone connections than people, and where the pressure to make net access available to everyone is unstoppable. And also where more and more of our interactions with each other are mediated through internet-connected devices. Because that shifts the social structures within which broadcasting happens, even if broadcasting continues. The talking about television programmes, the engagement online, all that is important. And given that the BBC was created to deliver the benefits of an emerging communications technology to the UK and the world, read the 1926 Charter, that's what it says, it's done very well so far, but the nature of those modern communications technologies has changed so much, I don't think the BBC has kept up. From the 30s onwards, the BBC was distinctive. It sat between the propaganda of the fascist states and the unrestrained commercialism of the United States during the 30s and 40s and 50s. It's done an enormously important job. Because it could rely on its funding mechanism, it was independent of government control, or direct government control anyway, taking Annie's point, and Sophie's point, and also didn't have to seek commercial revenue. And that worked, and it defined public service broadcasting for at least the latter half of the 20th century. But the affordances of the network are not the same as those of broadcasting. So now the net is the current core communication system. We need the BBC and every public service broadcaster to describe and shape an equivalent to the public space that was carved out by broadcast technologies. When you think about public service networking, we need to do for public service networking what the BBC, under its existing charter and previous ones, did for public service broadcasting. So in the past 6 years within the BBC, I've been helping to define a model for an online public sphere, a space for civil society online that we call the digital public space. And I think that's still a really important overarching framework for thinking about the BBC in this context. Because the BBC needs to think about the future uses of technology as an engineering organisation. It needs to think about what it does and what it creates and curates as a cultural organisation. And it will remain a broadcaster of global importance for at least the foreseeable future. You know, I accept television is not going away this year, next year, the year after. The thing we call television may change, but it's not going to vanish. So we need a broad discussion about the role of the network in society, and that network not just as a space for commercial activity or entrepreneurship or digital government, which is where it largely is. And if you look at the current BCMS consultation about the shape of the digital society, it's very much around a space for entrepreneurship and economic activity. We want the debate about the BBC Charter to take place in that context. So I suppose I'll finish by saying that I'm not actually arguing that the debate about digital is missing from the Charter discussion. I'm arguing that the Charter discussion is missing from the debate about digital, and that it should be part of that. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. So have your questions very ready. I think what we've heard about digital futures and need for innovation, and my sense of that, and this refers as much to our own sector as it actually does to the BBC, is that's very difficult to do when you're constantly under threat of funding being removed. And things, you know, departments are being cut back and moved around all the time, does not lend itself to great creativity and innovation. Talking about independence, which I think is such a key issue for the BBC, how to assure independence, particularly from those threats of funding withdrawal, whichever the government it is, and their ability to do that is going to be key in any structures of governance going forward. And that in itself will have, I think, some relationship to the notion of public value that then is attached to the BBC. If you can see a sense of independence, this is a BBC that is doing certain things that are completely absent in other sectors, that is representing minority ethnic communities well, that is actually talking to a younger audience well that is doing all the things that we know are missing in the commercial environment, then that notion of its value, I think, will engender a more active support of that, as Des said. So I think there's all sorts of ways in which that can be done, but the overriding question is, how can we push that agenda? You know, all of these things are true, and we are talking about an ideological battle in some ways in changing that notion of what public value is, away from an purely economistic one, to something which has a much more of a social dimension to it, and is, well, entrenched in the social and the political. And these have to be key questions for our sector. So if you had, apart from chaining yourself to the railings,
That don't exist. But
which
yeah.
don't exist, which I actually don't think is a bad idea at all. But I'll come with you, Sophie. We'll do that. But what can we do in the intervening period? You know, we have a year before this is supposed to be guaranteed. You know, that this will be wound up. We don't know. Well, some of us may have ideas on how that may play out, but there are all sorts of possibilities that the government and the BBC will be discussing. It's up to us now to put pressure on those discussions as a public voice, to try and influence what goes on. What would you do?
I don't know. I think it's very difficult. We've had lots of meetings which had nothing to do with the television inquiry, but if I had my media reform hat on, we've had meetings, for example, with 38 Degrees, where you have sat down and said, what can we do? Because we don't have a year, we have 3 months. Because so much of this is out of our hands. It really is. These are high-level discussions between a handful of quite ideologically motivated people with different constituencies, short-term, mid-term, probably none of them long-term. It's going to be really tough. So we went through what could we do? Do we want to put a campaign which is aimed at the BBC itself? That they're not actively representing the audience? No, probably not. Do we want something in the government? How are you? I think probably the most viable solution may be that at a very local level, that you just aim at MPs and you do it as militantly as possible to make sure that there is not any kind of backbench support for what Osborne and other people want to do. Because frankly speaking, most local constituency MPs probably want a healthy BBC so they can show their faces on it and be listened to on the air. We weren't sure about doing that. Actually, what we agreed on, although we never got around to do this, was that we should probably show that the attack on the BBC comes, one of its sources is to do with an agenda set by its commercial rivals. And what we wanted to do was to find out how many meetings had taken place between the government and particularly people at the Mail and News UK. So that's one of the things we just did with the Guardian just ran, that they'd had, I can't remember now, is it 10 meetings between Murdoch's group, 8 of which were attended by Murdoch, in the last year, and then 2 people from Murdoch met with Osborne. That's days.
In a matter of days.
Yeah, a matter of days before. But actually, so what we now know, I mean, that doesn't take us further forward at a level of activity. These are the things that we already know. So can I bounce it to everyone else? It's very rare I say I don't know, but I think it's a genuine, unless you get licence fee payers, i.e. British people, actively willing to do something, then it's going to be tough. And so far, we haven't seen evidence of that. Not because they don't care, but they don't feel strongly enough in their own ability to change the views of the people who make the decisions.
Sophie actually is in a good position to answer that.
Yeah, it's your responsibility.
Yeah.
I think we're in a very difficult position, because I think that certainly the Secretary of State has made a lot of very positive noises the whole time since he came into his position, and he really hasn't stood by any of them yet. So I'm not sure DCMS is in listening mode. That's one problem we face. Just to let you all know, BLV managed to secure... BLV managed to secure a diary date for you all. 10th of February, 5:30 p.m. in Westminster, in Portcullis House. John Whittingdale has agreed to do an in-conversation with BLV's President, Colette Bow. So you're all invited. Contact BLV if you want to come. It's free. And we're delighted that, because we've spent about the last number of years anyway, trying to get a Secretary of State to come and talk to us, and we've finally succeeded. Goodness knows why it must be in his interest to come, but come and point some challenging
10th
questions.
of February.
10th of February.
You'll miss my
5:30,
lecture in
yeah.
Southampton on the open web and its enemies.
Oh my God. Can you do it by Skype? You're technologically advanced. You can do that. Anyway, so that's the first thing I say. I think it's very difficult when, as you say, there could be ideological or pragmatic reasons for the government taking a stance against the BBC. I think the public campaigns, the 38 Degrees campaigns, that we face a real problem here. I recently had a meeting at the Trust, the BBC Trust, where I challenged them on the BBC Three decision on the basis that there was a huge campaign against BBC Three closure as a broadcast platform. And they said, yeah, but most of that was as a result of the Save BBC Three campaign, which is an online campaign. It's clicktivism. It's not something we can respond to. Now, the 192,000 responses to the Green Paper, many of those were as a result of, it was a 38 Degrees campaign, wasn't it? I think that these campaigns, although they do show some measure of public engagement, a certain constituency of the public will get involved in these campaigns who are sort of active online, I think they're quite easy to dismiss by whoever it is, the organisation that's receiving them, because they're quite easy to do and they don't necessarily take much time.
I think quite often they deserve to be dismissed. The problem is
that...
that...
I think it's an easy excuse to say, well, 180,000 of the responses were, let's say, online as a result of, 38 Degrees or Avaz or whoever was running the campaign. And I fear the DCMS is meant to be publishing this month, as I understand it, an analysis of the responses, which shows some form of transparency, which would be great. And that may indicate how many of the responses were online, kind of click here, and how many were actually individuals responding. I agree, we need to get the public involved, and it's been a great success in some ways, I think, some of the public engagement, but if you can just dismiss that just like that, because, it's just an online campaign, is there any value in it? How do we involve the public? Well, are we going to get the public to come out and march about the BBC when you have an NHS that is crumbling, you have huge issues over the migrant crisis, about loads of other really, really important issues? Is broadcasting that important? Well, of course, I would say it is very important, but it's not as immediate as other issues, and I think. But
it's also, marching's not the way to engage in the debate or to build an active population, is it?
No, but it's one way to demonstrate that there is public concern or public support for the BBC.
I don't think there's any lack of awareness there is public concern. I think there are two aspects, though. One is that we have a government which unexpectedly found itself with a mostly working majority, that had made a number of promises it never thought it would be in a position to deliver, and believed it would have to negotiate down, being driven by a group of people who somebody who wasn't politically neutral would call unthinking zealots. But of course I am politically neutral, so I wouldn't use those terms, in directions they don't necessarily even agree with themselves. And that's true in a number of different policy areas. I actually feel much more optimistic. Firstly, because I'm lucky enough to work with people in the BBC who I know are of good spirit and really trying to do the right thing. And indeed, the engagement I've had with DCMS and politicians makes me believe there are enough good people around who, if given something to work with, would come out with a good outcome.
I think that's sort of a key thing. A difficulty which I have with all this is that, as I said, the economic arguments actually show that the economistic view is wrong in its own terms. The bad news is it is quite a complicated subject.
Yes.
And so I think that there is a lack of understanding, literally. So obviously what underpins the Green Paper is Wittow's sort of intuitive feeling, which sort of deep down is at the sort of Animal Farm level, which is the BBC is publicly funded, therefore there's a sort of subtext which is by definition it's inefficient, and so on. We're always reading about how inefficient it is, etc., etc. But also once you've got digital technology, we sort of don't need to look at the facts. it is obvious that as consumers we would be better served. And the reason we did that Reuters Institute analysis was to say, well, what actually would happen, and no, the public would not, even as consumers, be better served. I cannot put my hand on my heart and say this is a completely straightforward thing for ordinary people to understand. So there's a genuine problem of, how do we simplify this enough? Now, there are some killer stats. I think that nearly 40% of waking hours versus, I think that the fact that the Premiership rights are going to cost almost as much from this autumn as the total budget of BBC television. Now, I gave a talk last month at a yacht club to the, as one does, to the, not on the yacht, but to the Oxford alumni in Suffolk. Okay, I was very much.
So it was only a modest yacht.
Okay. And so these
people engaging with community.
The point is, once you start saying things like the Premiership rights cost about, people get that.
Yes.
So we need to start saying, can we find some sort of simple things which, even if you can't understand the full analysis, it is obvious that there is a problem if Witto is trying to squeeze the BBC, which costs, whatever, £2.80 a week per household. By the way, let's not let them get away with this idea that the BBC is now paying for licence fees for the over 75s. The BBC is now paying the licence of any household which has one or more people aged 75 or more, regardless of the number of people in the household, the number of earning people in the household, the household income. It is a spectacularly badly targeted intervention by Gordon Brown. And if they'd had any guts, they would have pointed the finger at Gordon Brown and said, we are going to phase it out. But they didn't do that. So, I think we need to obviously use multiple channels. I agree with Des that actually getting at the more reasonable kind of MP, okay, because some of them really are not. But if you've got a reasonable MP, then they are actually open to this. I think that the 38 degrees of this world do have some effect. In other words, you can't completely write them off. This is all about the art of the possible. Being, if you like, from the world I'm from, I would tend to focus more on opinion formers and so on. So the fact that Claire Enders, bless her, whose whole business model it's a subscription model, companies pay for Enders analysis reports, and she's put all the stuff about PSB outside the paywall. Okay, get your students to look at those. There's a lot of free stuff out there, and then of course we have to target quite a lot of what we're doing at the better informed people as well. We need all of the above.
I think there is one concrete thing that would make a difference though, because so part of the problem is once a policy is announced by a politician, it's very hard for them to change. Proposals, a people's charter that people could sign up to, something that was actually a concrete set of this is how the BBC could be financed, could be regulated, could be run, to respond to before there's anything on the table from either the BBC or DCMS. It could shape the debate because it allows the politicians to adopt these ideas and not lose face in doing so before they have committed to anything else. And that's something where a concrete document like that with 200,000 people backing it on change.org or 30 would have some impact, because there's a real thing that people said we agree with this, and it's that fact of agreement is important.
I really like that as an idea, and I wonder whether that, Sophie, building on you've developed a bill, and my initial response to that was, well, okay, that's coming out of the BLB. How much support will that have? Because how much consultation has it, got behind it, and how much grassroots involvement has there been? Whereas actually, if it's a people's charter of the BBC, you change the terms of it in a different way. You're not constrained by legislative language either. which is actually really difficult, having done it lots of times. It's actually quite hard to work with.
I believe King's are doing some research, which is the Trust is going to be publishing soon. They were commissioned by the Trust to look into the Charter and how effective it is, and whether there are other statutory.
But this is outside.
But I think that would be interesting if one's interested in charters and what the possibilities are. I think that's what they've been asked to do, is to look at what are the possibilities, and that's meant to be coming out this month. I'm not sure when.
Yeah, lots of questions. Let's go, Peter here, and then Sam.
I should know this, but what does the Green Paper say about the Trust, and what do you in the panel say about that? Because
hang on, collect these first. Let's do three.
My question is really about how the BBC, what the panel think a fight back from the BBC would look like. I'm Neil Gavin from the politics department at Liverpool. It strikes me that we're not in the realm of the what's the BBC ever done for us. Very witty, quite commanding, and exercising. But it's not just about getting extra money. It's a fight back, as Des quite rightly put it, a fight back against quite a subtle programme to undermine the BBC from a stance of neoliberal dogma. That sounds like, anyway. So it's got to be much more sophisticated, and I don't think the Charter thing is going to cut it with anyone other than Guardianistas. What would the thing about the John Cleese and the what's the BBC ever done for us? It's easily understandable. Touched on a very potent issue, and was witty at the same time. What does the panel think the comparable thing for the defence of public sector broadcasting would look like? There's a lot of very bright, creative people in the BBC. What are they going to do to project this defence of public sector broadcasting? What should they do?
I really wonder whether the people in the commercial sector really support this review. I think that the views that are being represented are of a tiny number of people, not of organisations, but just of people in this. And if you think about the fact of the matter is that the commercial sector, as it has grown up since the Second World War in this country, has never been, has always been in the presence of the BBC. Now, I was active in broadcasting and television in the 70s, 80s and 90s. I never worked directly for the BBC, but it was always there. And one of the really critical factors was actually, it wasn't commercial competition, it was cultural competition. And the presence of the BBC, in my experience, working for independent television companies, actually drove a lot of the desire for excellence. And so you would never have had Survival in Anglia without the BBC actually sort of pursuing a pathway in terms of natural history broadcasting. I worked at Thames, and it was a tremendous producer of factual programming. In response to the BBC, we wanted to do better than the BBC, as at Granada. So the fact of the matter is, in my view, that the success of commercial television or commercial broadcasting in this country is actually part of this ecology. The fact that commercial broadcasters are able to sell programs, formats, all sorts of things all over the world is partly due to the fact that it is part of this ecology. It is also the free flow of personnel, of technicians, of producers, writers and so on, many of whom actually experiment and learn their trade at the BBC. They have a safe place for innovation, which then comes into the commercial sector. So the idea that within the commercial sector, anybody beyond Murdoch and a few people like that actually want to remove the BBC because it is such an important part of this ecology, I think is wrong. I think that there is a big argument for actually mobilising elites. I think that we should start to ask shareholders of these companies whether the putative owners actually represent them, because what we've seen, particularly when ITV was deregulated, was an absolute car crash when they went when they just went for the lowest common denominator, and they lost viewers in their millions, and they nearly folded. So the idea that competition the BBC crowds out, I think is debatable. The fact of the matter is that the BBC enables quality television to exist right across the board, both in this country and across the world. And I think this is a very important aspect which we should be asking shareholders and senior executives, senior producers within not just broadcast television, but right across the media world. Do you really think that it's a good idea to do this? And I bet you get the answer, this is a terrible idea.
But they're not the problem. It's in answer to your question, what should the BBC do? It's obvious. A year ago I would have said, you just need to get Jeremy Clarkson to get his tank outside the headquarters of Dacre Towers. Sadly, it's too late for that now. But it's not about the commercial broadcasters. This is about an agenda which has been co-partnered by particular proprietors. I just think, what would I love to see? First of all, there is what happens inside the BBC is critical. So when people talk about Bill talks about the great staff, I would also talk about the strength of the unions, that they need to be much more active, they need to be included in this conversation. It's a shame that they spend so much of their time having to organise against redundancies instead of actually being able to organise collectively to defend the principles of public service broadcasting. I would love to see the BBC use its resources to. I don't expect the BBC just to start pumping out as it would be called propaganda by the Sun and the Mail. But I do expect it to be more imaginative and more robust in using all the services and programmes to start for a start, in terms of news and current affairs, documentaries, panoramas about this issue are not unthinkable. At the moment, they probably are unthinkable from the executive's point of view, but they shouldn't be. This is a genuine subject. I would like to see Radio 1 roadshows where one of the elements is, let's talk about, they should have Paddy on stage. What would life be like without One Extra, without Match of the Day, without all of these things, without the coverage of Wimbledon? They can do that without actually even embarrassing themselves. And as far as I can see, there's a lack of political will. Is it political will? It's some kind of will to use all the resources at their disposal, about lobbying, about giving confidence to other people to lobby. And so when they do it, the only time they seem to have done it is that one letter of the Loveys letter, which then got nailed in the Murdoch and Dacre press. And that was about it. I think there are many other things they could do.
Now, you asked about governance, I think, and I mean, actually that was the only good bit of the Green Paper. I thought that the policy options for governance and the costs and benefits were talked about in a very balanced way in that final section of the Green Paper. I happen to be someone who thinks that actually governance depends more on individuals than on structures, and based on my own personal experience as well. So I think sometimes it's talked about as if it's a branch of mathematics, and the idea that you can't have an institution which is both a cheerleader and a regulator. Well, actually, parents, managers always have role ambiguity, that you represent your department in the group further up, and at the same time you're evaluating the people who report to you. So I think people exaggerate it. Having said that, I actually think we're moving towards a solution which will get quite widespread agreement, which is a unified board in which the chairman of the BBC is the chairman of that board, and you have non-execs and so on. In other words, it's like a company board, and its job is clearly to represent the success of the institution. And then, as the BBC itself has said, an external regulator. The only ambiguity is, should Ofcom be that regulator? I'm one of the people, I think probably in a majority, who thinks no, Ofcom should continue doing what it does, and you probably need, in my view, a relatively small but not weak charter review body, which then uses the expertise of Ofcom for doing economic analyses and so on. But I think that we're actually getting close to saying a unified board is where we want to end up, and that's my prediction of what will emerge from the review, and it's one I think that gets rid of a lot of the nonsense which we've had. I don't think it'll make anything like as much difference as some people think. On the question of have the commercial people thought it through, I completely agree with the question. And when we say commercial people, really I'm talking about ITV. I think that I was very disappointed by the ITV submission. I gather that in front of the select committee, the bosses from ITV then backed down a little bit because they realised that their submission on the BBC had been sort of unduly hostile. These are sort of senior business people who have so much potty training in, if you like, automatically wanting to compete and looking for ways of, they're not Putin-esque, but they're close to a zero-sum view of the market, and therefore, they find it hard. It's like your cat chasing birds. Their natural instinct is to say, anything which is good to the BBC is bad for us. The people 2 levels further down who are more sophisticated understand what you're talking about, which is one reason. I mean, this is why I want to see the ecology put far more explicitly onto the radar screen, because it really is a very good metaphor for what we've got. One of its strengths is that it draws on 3 complementary sources of revenue, and the fact that the BBC competes for viewers but doesn't compete for revenue. And by the way, that's why, when Peacock was set up, should the BBC be partly funded? Exactly the same when the subject of subscriptions. So Elstein goes on about subscriptions and so on. Who are the people most strongly opposed to subscriptions? Sky. Sky don't want it. So do your best competing for revenue and then competing for quality, which is what you describe. And yes, I have been disappointed, but let's keep making a noise about it.
We agree to a certain extent. I think it's a bit more complex in one sense, in that the BBC Trust is not a regulator. The BBC Trust is a hybrid organisation where the bits from the old governance came in, and it is a cheerleader as well as a regulator. And so if you are going to break apart the BBC Trust, then which parts naturally fit within a unified board and which parts naturally fit with a regulator? And I think Ofcom's view, the view that we've always held, is that there are some elements of what the Trust does that are a natural fit with what Ofcom does. And that's really around the sort of programme complaints and fairness and impartiality and harm and all the stuff that we do on a regular basis. So we have absolutely no problem with that. I think where it gets difficult is, first of all, finance, who agrees the budget. We think it should be a unified board. And then the bit in the middle, which is around performance. And the Trust currently have this Byzantine system of service licenses and purpose remits, which actually I helped to devise when I was at the BBC. But it's really whether, is that part of regulation? I mean, to some extent we regulate Channel 4 in that way, but it's very light touch. And could you regulate the BBC in that sort of light touch way? I doubt it. And so I think we're more worried about where that sits and whether it would really sit with a regulatory body rather than an oversight or a governance body.
By the way, I agree with that.
Lizzie.
Lizzie Jackson, London South Bank University. I agree with Bill that the architecture of media delivery is changing. It's becoming networked and global and totally audience-centred. I was involved in at EU level in changing the governance of public service media in 2012, and about 6 of us worked for 2 years, and we very carefully made a declaration and recommendation that allowed for many platforms and new models of public service media. A development of that research is to a 4-year project. I'm a year in, 3 years to go, to look at ecosystems, to look at tools for change to enable public service media to change. But my suggestion is, and I'd like the views of the panel, is we need a radical rethink. We need tools for change. We need to create a public service media that's ready for continual adaptation, that's geared towards small pilots, not large pilots like BBC Jam, and that seeks and looks for new institutional models.
Big question. Karen?
Karen Boyle-Sterling. I'm not sure if this is really a question or a comment, but I suppose it's just that it's not just the nature of media that's changed, it's the nature of the first B in the BBC, and that actually this discussion needs to take into account what what the public of public service broadcasting is in this context. So what does that mean with greater devolution? What does it mean? I mean, we're having a discussion about whether the BBC will exist in 10 years. Britain might not exist in 10 years. And so how do we make the BBC relevant to that shift in context? And I've not seen enough about that in the current debate.
Catherine from Nesta. Just to raise a point on your point in terms of looking at the role of public service broadcasting and other players as well, Nesta's doing quite a lot of work with parts of the BBC to specifically look at community journalism and hyperlocal media in the context of local journalism, and working quite closely with certain people around how we could pilot certain things, or certain elements of the BBC that could be opened up. But yeah, I'm happy to chat about that afterwards, or sort of send some information through about that work.
From the panel. Sophie.
With reference to devolution, the BBC Trust's obviously got its ongoing, about to close consultation. I think it's its final consultation, isn't it? I don't know, that's what I heard. About the nations, about news and online in the nations, which we will be submitting to. And we've got a conference next Wednesday in Glasgow. I don't know if you're aware of that. Sorry, I seem to feel like I'm advertising all our events. Anyway, it's good to know that we're actually doing things.
So advertising is good.
Is it good? Yeah, okay. Yeah, you're a marketer.
But not for the BBC.
I'm too apologetic. I'm like the BBC. I think it came up before, one of the problems the BBC has in responding to this whole charter debate is either it looks like it's blowing its own horn, its own trumpet, and being very arrogant about how brilliant it is, or it's defensive.
Yeah.
And I think that it's really hard for the BBC itself to speak on behalf of itself in this debate. And that's one of the things that possibly we can do, is try and unpick the public value. You're talking about public value. Public value is very, very important. And it's letters to the papers. It's silly stuff like that actually might get through the cracks. The BBC can't do that very well. Actually, the BBC's rubbish at it, I think. I think the BBC comes across really badly in this debate. And that's something that frustrates me deeply.
You need to distinguish between the BBC as a journalistic institution which will only report on itself if it is of news value, and the BBC as a public corporation which has people paid to get its message across.
Well, I think,
and as a BBC journalist, I would only report on something the BBC does if it passed the test of...
I'm not talking about the BBC reporting about itself.
No.
I'm talking about it presenting itself. When Tony Hall launched, for example, in September, the first draft of sort of BBC Tomorrow proposals, and in those there was sort of there was outcry, local media. None of it seemed to have been pinned down in advance. All the music streaming stuff that actually then a whole load of
You might almost think it was a desperate scramble for things for the DG to say in that speech.
Never. Anyway, it sounded great, but then afterwards there was this whole backlash. The BBC's really bad at this, and the Trust, I know this from the Trust. Yeah. The Trust say, because I've complained to the Trust that they're really bad at explaining the value of what they do. It seems to me the Trust has been kind of slightly embarrassed. I don't think there was consensus about the Trust from the beginning, politically or otherwise. I think there's been an argument about whether the Trust should exist ever since the Trust was created. And I think that's a real problem. Whatever we have next, we need to try to get consensus around it, so that it doesn't spend the whole time kind of hiding what it does under a bushel, being slightly embarrassed. Am I a cheerleader, aren't I? It shouldn't be both.
That's the reason for having a unified board, and I think we have actually got. But I think we have got consensus about that.
It should be better at blowing its own trumpet, because I think that we really feel the Trust has done an enormous amount in engaging the public, in terms of getting the public to think about what it wants. And getting the public's feedback, making the BBC more transparent. I think the BBC is still incredibly opaque. I work for an organisation, the other organisation I work for, International Broadcasting Trust, and we do research into how much international content there is and the nature of international content on the BBC and all the public service broadcasters, trying to get any engagement over research and data within the BBC. Oh no, it's commercially sensitive, we can't talk about that. Now, Channel 4 publishes how many hours of international it does a year. It doesn't have to, actually, and it does. It publishes it in its annual review. The BBC doesn't engage in that way. The BBC's terrified, it feels to me, and I think the BBC we shouldn't be terrified. It should embrace the licence fee payers, and I think the Trust has done a really good job of that, and we want to retain that. So Paddy, in your model, which I think is the off-beat light model, there seems to be an off-beat heavy and off-beat light,
Yes.
which is the sort of two models that Sir David Clementi's talking about in his review.
Yes.
The
We don't call it off-beat.
No, we're not allowed to call it off-beat.
No, we call it the Charter
called?
Review Body.
The Charter, is that the new?
Yes.
That's the new
Yes.
name for it, Charter Review.
Because off-beat makes it sound economistic again.
Yes. So we would support that, but I think the BBC Trust has a real problem. It says in publicising its good works, because the only time we ever get any media coverage is in the Daily Mail when it wants to slag us off, or the Telegraph.
We have
so
5 minutes left, so, and I've seen Peter. Is there anybody else with a burning question? And Sharon.
Peter Lewis, London Metropolitan University. I agree that with I think most of the panel that all kinds of different ways have got to be adopted, including chaining ourselves to the structure. I will bring Jameson's whiskey and cups of tea. And I think it's difficult. The opaqueness of the BBC I've met in two areas. One was in the Radio Academy when I was involved in research, and finding out the data from the BBC at that time was difficult, but it wasn't impossible. The second thing was when I worked in ITV, there was the Free Communications Group. Remember that? It was amazing to me to go into what was then what was the place opposite the Langham, that's right, where the club was, and listen to people, producers at the sort of middle level of the BBC, slagging off the higher management. It was the time of McKinsey, I think. But it was really important and interesting for those outside to hear what was going on in the minds of the creative people in the BBC. Now, is there anything like that going on at the moment? That is, within the BBC, that we could use and help them?
Good question, Sharon.
Mine was more of a comment, because I really liked the fact that you called for... Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Now I can.
Cool. I was saying, I like the fact that we asked for more involvement by the public. You know, we want the public to be on the side of BBC. And what I think is one of the problems that we need to sort out is to identify how can we get, what can we do? Because that's one of the things, you know, if you ask the public, oh, we want your help with the new BBC charter, they're like, okay, I signed the petition online, but other than that, I don't know what to do. So chaining, definitely, but we might want to come up also with other simple, I think, gestures other than online petitions that we can get people to engage in without too much effort, but just to show their support.
Tattoos. Everyone should get the BBC blog.
BBC tattoo, sì.
Can I sneak in as well?
That's a good one. Okay, so is there a space within the BBC?
Sorry, can I sneak in as
yes,
well? I had one quick question. What alarmed me when I read the documentation was the big question about should it serve all audiences? If the BBC doesn't serve all audiences, then it's not really the BBC, surely? So what do you guys, I just wanted to know what you think about that, really.
You know what I think about that. I mean, you're absolutely right. And the principle of universality rather than best efforts needs to be, you know, hard baked into anything. Otherwise, you know, you're heading towards David Elstein territory faster than even David would be comfortable with it. So we shouldn't. I agree entirely. And in fact, in the discussion about the move from broadcast technologies over radio waves to IP distribution, one of the big sticking points is how do you guarantee universal access, you know, free at the point of delivery on the existing infrastructure. Now there are engineering and technical approaches to this which could be deployed. Okay, BT do not charge people extra for BT Vision as part of their data cap. They can do it by using what's called multicast technology. They don't make that available for iPlayer. So there are a number of regulatory issues around the broadband infrastructure that, if they were resolved, would make it a lot easier to feel comfortable about moving away from freebie distribution. It's still to the big screen on the wall. So it's still the thing we persist in calling television. Talk to me at supper about that. But it's not modulated radio waves using specialist services. So there are issues there.
Our issue is that the infrastructure isn't ready yet. So, and people in television, they get very excited about technological change. In my experience, having worked in it, for a number of years, and they get very, very excited about it. But you've got to bear in mind your average listener and viewer. I'm not saying that everybody's a Luddite, but there are quite a few people out there who quite enjoy their Freeview box, not paying unlimited broadband, and we don't think that people should. The other question I've got is that if everything ends up IP, okay, competition tends to drive prices down, and Ofcom's obviously across all this in terms of how broadband, how broadband how consumers are charged for their broadband. But if it's all going to be down tubes at the end of the day, there's a huge power there for.
Well,
surely,
it's
not going to happen. We've had people model the cost.
We've said until DTT is safe until 2030.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about that, and beyond that, I will be surprised if DTT is.
Okay.
You're one of the great.
A martini in the Langham if DTT is still going in 2030.
James and Bill, you need to talk to this man, Bill. You need to talk to this man.
You need to listen to this man.
Final comments to send away.
Public service networking is the way you address these issues, by moving from just think about broadcast ecology into the network ecology and how audiovisual and everything else fits into that. I'll shut up now.
Well, the opacity thing is interesting. One of the things which worked quite well at the Yacht Club in Suffolk was a slide showing the TARDIS, which they are all familiar with, because it is one of the sort of mysteries about the Beeb. If you hear anyone who's inside the BBC, they all say W1A is barely a parody, and stuff full of clever Oxbridge arts graduates screwing each other. I meant politically, not a bit of the other as well. And completely. If you deal with the BBC compared to Channel 4, it's an infuriating organisation to deal with, even when you're trying to help them. Okay, and yet, so the inside of the TARDIS, there's this huge bureaucratic, hopeless organisation, totally dysfunctional, and then you take a step back outside the TARDIS and you say, £2.80 per week per family, and what has the BBC ever done for us? It is quite astonishing how much we all get as consumers and as citizens, and we just need to keep coming back and saying that through every possible channel.
I'll accept your thanks later.
My final word. Two final words. Firstly, if anybody in this room would like to work with BLV on our policy work, because we do try to put out policy that's sensible as much as we can. We've been trying to pull together a sort of forum of academics for a long time. So if anybody's interested, if they could get in touch with us, we'd be really delighted to hear from you. And for example, at the moment doing this Nations consultation, I'm in touch with a few people in the Nations, although I'd love to speak to you from Stirling. We're a bit short on Scotland at the moment, and if anybody's here from Northern Ireland, please come and see me, because I have no input on Northern Ireland at all. Students, anybody really. We just want to know what people think of broadcasting in the Nations, and make sure, because I'm based in the South East, I don't get to see it. How can I write a submission on that? And we want to try to represent the views of those all over the country. So please get in touch with us. And finally, if anybody wants to chain themselves to the railing of DCMS, get in touch with me, because I'll be in charge of coordinating that once we've had a chance to read the white paper.
Yes. One of my worries is that when this chaining takes place, are we going to get a BBC news crew coming down and condemning outside agitators? But anyway, more seriously, the question about universality is critical, because it's on the very first page of the executive summary. And it's astonishing how important it is for the architects of the Green Paper to basically disrupt what we have had for 80 years, that universality is the thing they want to go after. Yeah. For me, it's difficult to come up with the single thing that we should do, but certainly we shouldn't lose track of exposing the arguments of those people, of the motivations of those people who are challenging things like universality. They're doing it for particular ideological and pragmatic purposes. Some people are set to gain out of this. both in terms of ideas and in terms of revenues. And we should use, through students, through research, through any kind of journalistic contacts that we have, we need to make sure that we are using those circuits and our knowledge to make sure that we don't let them off the hook. And one of the things, the greatest irony is that we're talking about public service broadcasting or defending public service broadcasting without the active involvement of the public. That is a profound structural contradiction that we have to somehow get over. And I think the question of devolution is absolutely critical in this, because we can't treat, I mean, it's true that public PSBs are supposed to bring us together as one happy family, which doesn't quite make sense when we're not one big happy family. And one of the greatest things that the BBC and other PSBs could do is to recognise that. Simply by recognising that would help actually to start a conversation between different groups of people, and would make people probably value those institutions more. So I do need, it occurs to me, I haven't actually talked about the inquiry. We're organising meetings in the next couple of months in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland to acknowledge the fact that this is a very disrupted conversation that we're having, and we need to listen. Things, you know, there may be uncomfortable conclusions that arise from listening to people in Glasgow and Edinburgh and Inverness who do not share what we're saying at the moment. And that, if we don't do that, what's the point of this conversation? But for all of you, please, this is the inquiry into the whole ecology. So it's well beyond the BBC. This is about how we defend public service television, with apologies to Peter. It's about television for particular reasons. And we welcome all your thoughts. The cards here, which you have in front of you, please email paragraphs, ideas, in particular recommendations about any specific aspect, any bright idea that we need to take back, so that Lord Putnam is the chair, can frame that into a set of recommendations that he will be pursuing actively with some of the opinion formers. That's one element. The other element is, of course, what the public does and how we start to energise the public. But we will see.
I was quite serious about the demonstration.
Okay.
I am, because we may not chain ourselves, but actually, ultimately, if the white paper doesn't do it, then we've got to do something to embarrass John Whittingdale into submission.
And I'm not sure. A big march.
Yeah, I'm not sure what we'd do it other than actually we go and stand outside. How many demonstrations are there outside DCMS? None. It might be.
100 Parliament.
I know, but we'll make sure that we'll label
HMRC.
Yes.
I have demonstrated outside
outside DCMS. Well, there we go.
Well, let's go and pray. I think it's time to go and pray at the cathedral and drink wholesomely in the process. Can we say a very big thank you?
I acknowledge too that MeCCSA has been thinking about higher education policy itself, and obviously your own work in contributing to the debate is hopefully going to parallel what we're doing at the Academy. And to remind you, those of you who don't perhaps remember what the Academy of Social Science is, it grew out of a body called the Academy of Learned Societies in the Social Sciences, the intention being to give social science, which we know is baggy and involves a diversity of disciplines, a more focused and concentrated voice, because in national discussions, not least the ones we're engaged in now, the absence historically of a social science voice was remarkable.